Today I want to conclude my series of Bible studies I've been giving on the calendar by covering why we count to Pentecost as we do today in United from the weekly Sabbath that falls during the Days of Unleavened Bread. As I mentioned last time, the vast majority of Jews around the world, of Orthodox Jews, they count to Pentecost from the first Holy Day Sabbath, from the day after the first day of Unleavened Bread. And I covered, in my last Bible study, I covered the reasons why they do that and the pros and cons of that method of counting last time. The main group of Jews who today count as we do from the morrow after the weekly Sabbath are the Karaite Jews. Back at the time of Christ, the Sadducees, the Boethusians, and the Samaritans counted from the weekly Sabbath, or the day after the weekly Sabbath, as we do, while the Pharisees counted from the morrow after the first day of unleavened bread. And again, I objectively covered counting from the first day of unleavened bread or the morrow after the first day of unleavened bread last time. So today I want to cover counting from the morrow after the weekly Sabbath that falls during the Days of Unleavened Bread. And actually what I want to do today is I want to cover or touch on three things in this final Bible study on the calendar. Number one, I just want to touch on this because it's a situation that comes up occasionally. I'm not going to try to go into it or try to make a judgment one way or the other on it, but something that comes up just to touch on it. And that is what happens when the Passover day falls on a weekly Sabbath, which occurs occasionally. Number two, the role that prophecy plays in supporting counting from the weekly Sabbath as we do today. And then three, this was the most important part of the Bible study, I feel, is the spiritual implications of counting from the weekly Sabbath, which then eliminates a preparation day every year for Pentecost, and when you count from the weekly Sabbath. Because then Pentecost will always fall on a Sunday, the weekday before is a Sabbath, and it eliminates the preparation day for Pentecost. So the title for this final Bible study is The Calendar Part 15, Counting to Pentecost Part 2. And again, we'll be covering counting to Pentecost from the day after the weekly Sabbath that falls during the Days of Unleavened Bread. But the first thing I want to touch on here, and I'm just going to touch on it, is what happens when the Passover day falls on a weekly Sabbath, which happens occasionally. When that occurs, then the only weekly Sabbath that would actually fall during the Days of Unleavened Bread would be the last day of Unleavened Bread. Which raises a question, because you have the wave sheaf offered on the day after that Sabbath. When that occurs, and the only weekly Sabbath that occurs during unleavened bread is the last day of unleavened bread, then would the wave sheaf then have been offered on the morrow after the last day of unleavened bread, which would have meant that it would have been offered on the day after the Feast of Unleavened Bread ended. So the question then is, should the day of the wave sheaf was offered, should that day always fall during the Days of Unleavened Bread, since it portrayed the unleavened, sinless life of Jesus Christ? Or would it have been offered on the day after unleavened bread ended, on those occasions when the only weekly Sabbath that fell during unleavened bread would be the last day of unleavened bread? Again, I think telling everyone a little bit later, it'd be nice if I could put some of this up on a screen, but I'm just going to kind of go slowly and touch on this, and it's, you don't need to take notes, just listen, but just to kind of touch on some of these things to help explain the different situations you have that can occur. So the question then is, should the day the wave sheaf was offered always occur within and during the Days of Unleavened Bread, since it was an unleavened offering? So when the Passover falls on a weekly Sabbath, would the wave sheaf then have been offered on the day after the Passover, which would have been on the first day of unleavened bread, since the Passover is the day on which all leaven must be removed from our household? Now, the Passover does link with unleavened bread in one sense. It's a day that all leaven must be removed from your household on the Passover day, because that's to all be out before that day is over. And the Passover is intrinsically connected to the Days of Unleavened Bread in that situation. Now, in that situation occurs, when the Passover falls on a weekly Sabbath, as far as when the wave sheaf would have been offered, or when you should then start counting to Pentecost, is to a very large degree, it's a judgment call. in my view. Now some of you, just more scholarly than I am, looked into it, might have a more clear-cut picture. But I've looked at both sides, and to me it's kind of a judgment call. I'm not technical enough to really determinately make a decision one way or the other and say this is the way it should be done, for sure. But the United Church of God and nearly all other churches of God count to Pentecost from the morrow after the Passover, whenever the Passover falls on a weekly Sabbath. The only Church of God that does not, that I know of, is the Church of the Great God of John Reitenbaugh. They count to Pentecost from the morrow after the last day of unleavened bread on those occasions when Passover falls on a weekly Sabbath. So on those occasions then, the Church of the Great God will observe Pentecost 1 week later than we do. Otherwise, we're all in sync. Now, both sides, and I've looked into it a little bit, not for some time now, but back a few years ago I looked into it, and both sides will say that they feel that the Passover that's mentioned in Joshua chapter 5, I'm not going to go into Joshua 5, but both sides feel the Passover mentioned in Joshua 5 may have fallen on a weekly Sabbath. And both sides then try to use that particular situation, that chapter, to try to support their prospective methods for counting to Pentecost when the Passover falls on a weekly Sabbath. Again, I've looked at both, it's been some time, but I've looked at both positions using Joshua 5 to try to support their particular method. And it's not clear to me, I don't think it's dogmatically clear which way is correct in that way, using that particular example. Maybe some of you looked into that and come up with a clear reason why one is the other. But I've looked at both sides. One from Fred Coulter, supporting the way we do it, and John Reitenbaugh supporting the way he does it on those occasions. And it's not real clear to me. I both use Joshua 5 to support their position, so that shows a little bit unclear. But I think the stronger position is our position of counting from the morrow after the Passover, since the wave sheaf would then have been offered during the days of unleavened bread, rather than outside the days of unleavened bread. Again, that's only when the Passover occurs and falls on a weekly Sabbath. Now let's move on from that, and going on to why we count, generally speaking, from the morrow after the weekly Sabbath that falls during unleavened bread for counting to Pentecost. I want to touch on here, and not touch on, but I want to go into more depth, as to the role that prophecy plays when it comes to counting to Pentecost from the weekly Sabbath versus counting from the first day of unleavened bread. I believe prophecy is the main thing that supports the method that we use of counting to Pentecost from the weekly Sabbath that falls during unleavened bread. So I want to show how prophecy supports counting to Pentecost from the morrow after the weekly Sabbath. And again, as I said, that's, to me, is the primary scriptural support for counting to Pentecost from the weekly Sabbath rather than from the first day of unleavened bread, as the vast majority of Orthodox Jews around the world do today. First, let's look at what Paul wrote to the Galatians, the church in Galatia. Let's go to Galatians chapter 4. I'm just going to look at one verse here. It's a very informative verse. Galatians 4, verse 4. That's the only verse we're going to look at. Galatians 4, verse 4. It says, "But when the fullness of the time had come, God sent forth his Son." See, that tells me God had it all planned out in advance. God planned the time that Christ was going to be born, the time he was going to die, and he planned it down to the very day. Now, we don't know with absolute certainty on which day Christ was born. Probably, we know he was born in the fall. Some say probably on the Day of Trumpets. Some might say the first day of the Feast of Tabernacles, but we don't know which day it is for sure. But we do know with absolute certainty the exact day on which Christ died and the day on which he was resurrected. He died on the afternoon of the Passover day, at the exact time the Passover lambs were being sacrificed at the temple. So he could then become the Passover lamb slain from the foundation of the world. Revelation 13, verse 8. So our sins could be passed over. It all ties together, it all fits. Not only that, but God had also had it planned in advance, the year on which Christ would die, the day of the week on which Christ would die, how long he would be in the grave, and when he would ascend into heaven to be accepted before his Father as the wave sheaf offering. All those details were planned and prophesied in advance, and they were fulfilled by Christ precisely as they were planned and prophesied, to prove that Christ indeed was the promised Messiah. Let's look at how the day of the week and the year of Christ's death were prophesied. And we're going to go back to a section in prophecy in Daniel chapter 9. We'll go back to the 70 weeks prophecy. I'm not going to try to explain the 70 weeks prophecy. That's not my purpose. I'm not going to try to go through that. It takes somebody with probably more understanding than I do to go through and do that accurately. But I want to show you here from this prophecy in Daniel 9, it starts in Daniel 9, verse 24, and goes through verse 27, is the 70 weeks prophecy. But it shows how all these details surrounding Christ's death, resurrection, so on, were all, his birth, were all planned in advance, very, very precisely. Daniel 9, verse 24. 70 weeks are determined for your people and for your holy city, to finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, and to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Now, all of this is obviously prophetic of the death of Jesus Christ. And if you take 70 weeks, of course, a week is 7 days. So 70 weeks would be 70 times 7 days, or 490 days. Okay? A day, prophetically speaking, equals 1 year. And you can confirm that in Numbers 14, verses 33 and 34, and Ezekiel 4, verses 4 through 6. So 490 prophetic days, since the prophetic day is 1 year, 490 prophetic days would be 490 years. So prophetically then, Daniel 9:24 could read this way. 490 years are determined to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Now again, this prophecy primarily pertains to Christ's first coming, but ultimately there are portions of it that also could pertain to a second coming as well, which is when Christ will truly bring in everlasting righteousness. And everything will be sealed and finished. Again, let's just go through and read now, go on to verse 25. Daniel 9:25. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks, and the street shall then be built again, and the wall even in troublesome times. From the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem, it says. Now there were a total of 4 commands or decrees to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, if you go back and research history. Daniel received this vision probably around 538 BC, and the first command or decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem happened right about that time or just after that time. The first decree was issued by Cyrus in about 538 BC. The second decree was issued by Darius in 520 BC. The third was issued by Artaxerxes in 457 BC. And the fourth was issued by Nehemiah in 444 BC. All those had to do with aspects of restoring and rebuilding Jerusalem. The decree that pertains to Daniel 9:25 is a decree given by Artaxerxes in 457 BC. And we simply know that by process of elimination. It's the only one that it fits. In fact, you can actually read that decree. It's preserved for us in God's Word. You can actually read that decree given by Artaxerxes. You can read that in Ezra chapter 7, verses 11 through 26. Now, Daniel 9:25 then breaks up this 70 weeks prophecy into 3 segments. First, one segment of 7 weeks, a second segment of 62 weeks, and a third segment of 1 additional week, which is not mentioned there in verse 25. It's mentioned later, as we'll get to in just a moment. Now, 62 weeks, or I should say 7 weeks, 7 weeks would be 49 days or 49 prophetic years. 62 weeks would equal 434 days, or 434 prophetic years. And one additional week would equal 7 more days, or 7 additional prophetic years. Now, from 457 BC, from the decree by Artaxerxes to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, it took 49 years, or 7 prophetic weeks, to completely restore and rebuild Jerusalem. That's what it would seem, and that's what history would tend to support as well. From that point, it took another 62 prophetic weeks, or another 434 years, until Messiah the Prince would appear on the scene in his ministry, or until Christ would then begin his 3.5 years of earthly ministry. Going on in verse 26. And after the 62 weeks, Messiah should be cut off. In other words, once Jerusalem is completely restored, 434 years, or 62 prophetic weeks after that, it says Messiah will be cut off. And of course, I know he wasn't cut off at the beginning of that additional week, or 7 years. Yeah, he lived into that. He had a 3.5 year ministry. But of course, when he did die 3.5 years later, that would be after the 62 weeks. Going on in verse 26, let's read the whole thing, verse 26. And after the 62 weeks, Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end of it shall be with a flood. And until the end of the war, desolations are determined. Of course, that's referring, when you look back historically, to the destruction and desolation of Jerusalem by Titus in 70 AD. At the end of the war, to thwart the uprising of the Jews against Rome, began in the mid-60s. Of course, Rome thwarted that about 70 AD. Now, what about the one additional week, or the one remaining prophetic week of 7 years? It's going on here in verse 27 of Daniel 9. Verse 27, then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week. Again, I'm not trying to be technical. I'm trying to explain the 7 weeks prophecy. So please don't get too critical here with me on that, because I'm not trying to do that. I'm just trying to bring out some principles here to support why we count to Pentecost the way we do. Then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering. Of course, as we know, Christ's death brought an end to the Old Testament system of animal sacrifices and offerings. And we're even told that by the writer of Hebrews in Hebrews chapter 10. Christ caused the Old Testament sacrificial system to cease in the middle of the week by dying in the middle of the week. Now, he fulfilled that in 2 ways. Number 1, he was cut off in the middle of the last remaining prophetic week. He was cut off after only 3.5 years of his earthly ministry, as we're looking at, as we understand it, leaving 3.5 years yet remaining to be fulfilled. We used to speculate that might possibly take place in the place of safety, where the woman is nourished for a time, times and a half a time, or for 3.5 years, as we're told in Revelation 12, verse 14. But a second way we can understand that is he was literally cut off in the middle of the week. He died on the Passover, which fell on a Wednesday in the middle of the week in the year that he died. He died on a Wednesday, which is the middle of the week. Now, the bottom line in all this, without trying to get too technical or trying to figure out every detail, the bottom line is that God prophesied way in advance the precise year and the day of the week that Christ would die. He'd have to die in a year when the Passover fell on a Wednesday in the middle of the week. Well, we're told here in this 70 weeks prophecy. Now, from the decree of Artaxerxes in 457 BC, it will be 69 prophetic weeks, or 483 years, until Messiah begin his public ministry, which would then lead to his being cut off in the middle of the additional prophetic week. Now, depending on how accurately you count, taking into consideration there was no year 0, allowing for a possible variation or error of 1 year, by how you might interpret things going back that far, that would bring us to either 30 or 31 AD as the year on which Christ would have to die. Now, in both of those years, the Passover fell on a Wednesday in the middle of the week. That is using the Hebrew calendar. Passover fell on a Wednesday in 30 A.D. with or without using postponement rules. Passover fell on a Wednesday in 31 A.D., but only if you use postponement rules. Well, both those situations are considering using the Hebrew calendar. If there's some other form of calendar that was used, we can't confirm that one way or another, historically. As I covered in the previous Bible study, 31 AD is the only year that works as far as the Hebrew calendar is concerned. It's the only year that works in conjunction with what we are given in the Gospel of John, especially John chapter 7 to the end of John's Gospel, which I covered in detail in the previous Bible study and went through that. But the bottom line is this, as I look at it. God mathematically calculated far in advance, according to 70 weeks prophecy, the precise year and day of the week that Christ would die, and God didn't leave anything up to chance. Now, could God have manipulated things somehow to get them to come out right? Well, yeah, he could have, but I think he didn't leave anything up to chance. I think it was predetermined it would be fulfilled precisely as prophesied here in Daniel chapter 9, in the 70 weeks prophecy. This, to me, is also strong scriptural evidence that God did not depend on the weather. He didn't depend when the barley might ripen to signal the beginning of the year, as is done by the Karaite Jews in using their calendar. And also, it kind of tends to support, to me at least, that he didn't leave it up to when the new moon might or might not be sighted. To me, Daniel 9, verses 24 to 27 is very precise and lends strong support to the use of a fixed calendar that could be used for calculating far in advance, such as the Hebrew calendar does. But the question then becomes, what does all this have to do with counting to Pentecost? That's the main point I want to try to bring out today. Well, let's go back to another prophecy here, or another situation that occurred. It became a prophecy. Let's go back to the book of Joshua. Not Joshua, excuse me, the book of Jonah. Book of Jonah. Jonah chapter 1, verse 17. We just look at one verse here. Jonah chapter 1, in the Minor Prophets. Jonah chapter 1, verse 17. It says, "Now the Lord had prepared a great fish to swallow Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights." Of course, as we know, this also then became prophetic of Christ's death and resurrection. How everything would have to precisely work out according to God's calculation and God's plan. In fact, this prophecy right here of Jonah being in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights even indicates why the Passover would have to fall on a Wednesday in the middle of the week in the year that Christ would die. Now let's go to the fulfillment of this, as it was going to be fulfilled by Christ. Let's go to Matthew chapter 12. Matthew chapter 12. We're very familiar with, a lot of you are very familiar with these verses, but Matthew 12, beginning in verse 38. Matthew 12, beginning in verse 38. "Then some of the scribes and Pharisees answered, saying, 'Teacher, we want to see a sign from you. We want to see some sign that you really are who you say you are. You say you're the Son of God. You say you're the Messiah. Well, give us a sign to show us you truly are the Son of God. We want to see a sign.' Verse 39, "But he answered and said to them, 'An evil and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah,'" which we just read. "For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." So here's where prophecy, in my opinion, proves we should count to Pentecost from the weekly Sabbath, or from the morrow after the weekly Sabbath. Christ would have to die on a Wednesday in the middle of the week, and he would have to be in the grave for 3 days and 3 nights before being resurrected to fulfill becoming the wave sheaf offering. When did Christ become the wave sheaf offering? Let's go to John chapter 20. John 20 tells us. John 20, let's begin in verse 1. John 20, verse 1, this is after Christ's death and his resurrection, although the disciples don't know he's been resurrected, but this is the day after he died. He's been in the grave for 3 days and 3 nights, and this is after that. John 20, verse 1. Now on the first day of the week, which we call Sunday, now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene went into the tomb early, while it was still dark, where they had supposedly laid Jesus after he died. And they saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. Because they had up on the cliffs, they had caves there, and they put a stone over the cave, and that became a tomb for different people who were buried there. And the tomb that he was buried in had never been used before. Couldn't anybody else, just the body of Jesus. And just quickly, verse 6. Later Simon Peter came following him and went into the tomb, and he saw the linen clothes lying there, but no body. Verse 8. Then the other disciple, that would have been John, who came to the tomb first, went in also, and he saw the body wasn't there, and he believed he wasn't, maybe he'd been resurrected, didn't know for sure what happened, but he saw the body, believed that he wasn't there. The body wasn't there. He saw it was gone. Verse 9, for as yet they did not know the scripture that he must rise again from the dead. So they didn't realize that he was resurrected. They just saw somebody stole the body. But they realized, they believed what Mary said, that the body wasn't there. Verse 10, then the disciples went away again to their own homes. Verse 11, but Mary stood outside by the tomb weeping. And as she wept, she stooped down and looked into the tomb. And she saw two angels in white, sitting one at the head and the other at the feet, where the body of Jesus had lain. Then they said to her, woman, why are you weeping? She said to them, because they have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have taken him. And when she said this, verse 14, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but didn't know it was him. Didn't know it was Jesus. Didn't recognize him. Then Jesus said to her, verse 15, woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking? She, supposing him to be the gardener, said to him, well, sir, if you had carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away, and I'll give him a proper burial. Verse 16, then Jesus said to her, Mary, in a very compassionate voice, and she immediately recognized who it was by the voice. She turned and said to him, Rabboni, which is a teacher. She knew who it was. Now notice verse 17. Again, this is the first day of the week. It's Sunday. Then Jesus said to her, do not, and this is I'm reading from the New King James, which is a correct translation of this verse. Do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to my Father, but go to my brethren and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, and to my God and your God. Again, the New King James Version correctly translates verse 17. What Jesus said here is correctly translated in verse 17 as, do not cling to me. The old King James, the AV, has it, do not touch me. That is not a correct translation. The correct translation, do not cling to me. Again, what day of the week was this? Well, it was the first day of the week. It was a Sunday, verse 1. Why didn't Christ want Mary to cling to him? You can imagine how she'd want to cling to him. She thought he was dead. Then she thought somebody stole the body. Then she realized there he was alive, talking to her. You can imagine if somebody you thought was dead, that you loved very much, you're extremely attached to, had great deal of affection and love for, all of a sudden they're standing before you talking to you, you realize they're not dead, they're alive. You can imagine you want to put your arms around that person and you wouldn't want to let go. You just want to hug them and hold on for dear life. You're so overjoyed to realize they're not dead, they're alive. Why didn't Christ want Mary to cling to him? It tells us right here. Because he had not yet ascended to his Father. He had not yet ascended to his Father for what purpose? For the purpose of being accepted as the wave sheaf offering. Again, all this was calculated and prophesied in advance, and it was fulfilled precisely as prophesied and planned in advance by God. So why did the Passover have to fall on a Wednesday in the year that Christ died? Why did it have to fall in the middle of the week? Because after he died, he had to be in the grave 3 days and 3 nights. He died on the afternoon of Passover, by about 3 in the afternoon, and he would have been put in the grave around sunset that night. So he'd had been in the grave until sunset Saturday night to have 3 days and 3 nights. But he had to be in the grave for 3 days and 3 nights. And then after being in the grave for 3 days and 3 nights, he had to be resurrected and then ascend to his Father to be accepted as the wave sheaf offering. And he would have done that on the very day the wave sheaf would have been offered, just as he died at the same time the Passover lambs were being slaughtered. And the only way all that could be fulfilled precisely as prophesied would be to begin counting to Pentecost from the weekly Sabbath that falls during the days of unleavened bread. Why? If you counted from the first day of unleavened bread, or the morrow after the first day of unleavened bread, as Orthodox Jews around the world do today, if you'd count from that way in the year that Christ died, the wave sheaf then would have been offered on the next day. It would have been offered on the day after the first day of unleavened bread, which would have been on a Friday in the year Christ died. In the year Christ died, the Passover was on a Wednesday. The first day of unleavened bread was on a Thursday. And when was the wave sheaf offered? Again, quoting Leviticus 23, verse 11. He shall wave the sheaf before the Lord to be accepted on your behalf. On the day after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it. If that Sabbath was the first day of unleavened bread, as Orthodox Jews believe today, then in the year Christ died, the wave sheaf would have been offered on Friday, as that was the day after the first day of unleavened bread in the year that Christ died. If that was the case, then Christ would have had to ascend to his Father on Friday to be accepted as the wave sheaf offering. If that were the case, then you would have to try to squeeze 3 days and 3 nights between Wednesday sunset and before Friday sunset, which is a virtual impossibility. It can't be done. Which proves the wave sheaf had to be offered on Sunday in the year that Christ died, as Scripture indicates. And since the wave sheaf was offered on the day after the Sabbath, that Sabbath had to be the weekly Sabbath that falls during the days of unleavened bread in the year that Christ died. So prophecy and the precise fulfillment of prophecy proves we should count to Pentecost from the morrow after the weekly Sabbath, even as we do in United today. Now, I want to get to one final, I got 2 final important questions, but this is the most important part of the Bible study, I feel, is this next section here. A very important question. Why would God purposely eliminate a preparation day for Pentecost? See, if a day of preparation is important to God, then why would God want us to count to Pentecost in a way that ensures the day before Pentecost is always a weekly Sabbath, eliminating a day of preparation for Pentecost? Why would God want that? What can we learn from that? Is there anything spiritual lesson we can learn from that? It's very important. What does Pentecost portray? It portrays the spiritual harvest of the first fruits. The harvest for everyone God is now calling, and the harvest of all those who respond to that calling that God is giving them now. The first fruits must prepare to become what? What do we all prepare to become when Christ returns? We have to prepare to become the bride of Christ. We have to make ourselves ready to become the bride of Christ. That's the only way we prepare to be the bride of Christ, by making ourselves ready. We have to make ourselves ready. We must all prepare in advance by making ourselves ready in advance. In other words, we can't wait until the day before Christ returns to prepare. We can't wait to make ourselves ready to become the bride of Christ at the last possible moment before he returns. Let's go to the parable that shows that makes that point very clear. Matthew 25, the parable of 10 virgins. Matthew 25, beginning in verse 1. Then the kingdom of heaven shall be likened to 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. 5 were wise, and 5 were foolish. Now, why were the 5 wise and why were the other 5 foolish? We all know the story here. 5 were wise by taking oil in their lamps. They were prepared in advance. They made sure they had oil. And they made sure their oil was not going to run out. 5 were foolish. They took no oil in their lamps. They waited till the last moment. They didn't prepare in advance. Let's go down to verse 6, Matthew 25. And at midnight a cry was heard, behold, the bridegroom is coming. Go out to meet him. Then all those virgins arose and they trimmed their lamps. But you got to do more than just trim the lamp. You also have to have oil. And the foolish said to the wise, well, we got our lamp. We don't have any oil. We never went out and bought oil, so we're not prepared. Give us your oil, for our lamps are going out. But the wise answered, saying, no, lest there should not be enough for us and you, but go rather to those who sell and buy for yourselves. In other words, the point is, we each have to prepare for ourselves. We each have to make ourselves ready. We can't make someone else spiritually ready to become the bride of Christ. We can only make ourselves ready to become the bride of Christ. And that's a daily chore, daily job that we have, spiritually speaking. But no one else can do that for us. We're the only ones that can make ourselves ready. Going on in verse 10. And while they went to buy, the foolish went to buy and the foolish went to get prepared, the bridegroom came. And those who were ready went in with him to the wedding, and the door was shut. But afterward the other virgins also came, saying, Lord, Lord, open to us. We need more time here. You came very suddenly. We weren't prepared. We didn't think you were going to come at this time. We thought we still had lots of time left. Give us a little more time. We're not ready. We're not prepared. Verse 12. But he answered and said, assuredly I say to you, I do not know you. You had plenty of time. You had your whole lifetime since the time I called you. Watch therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour in which the Son of Man is coming. So we all have to be prepared spiritually in advance. We can't wait till the last day or the day before. There is no preparation day to become the first fruits. There is no preparation day for being ready for become the first fruits of God, as Pentecost portrays. We can't get spiritually prepared in one day or at the last possible moment. We must all be prepared in advance by making ourselves ready now, by working on that now, by making use of the time that we have right now. And that, in my view, is why God purposely wants us to count to Pentecost in a way that eliminates a preparation day for Pentecost. Because spiritually speaking, no one can make themselves ready to be part of the bride of Christ, to be part of the first fruits, in one day or at the last possible moment. We all must become prepared in advance. Now, before I close, I just want to look at one final question. And just this speculation on this, but I just want to touch on it because I think it's interesting and it does tie in. When was the Acts 2, the Pentecost mentioned in Acts 2, when was that observed? What day was that Pentecost observed on? Well, there's no clear historical record as to whether they observed it on Sivan the 6th, which is how the Jews observe it today, by counting from the first day of unleavened bread, by counting from a fixed day of the month. It's going to always occur on a fixed day of the month, on Sivan the 6th, regardless of what day of the week that might be. Now, there's no clear historical evidence as to whether that particular Pentecost in Acts 2 was observed on Sivan the 6th or on Sivan the 8th. If they had counted from the weekly Sabbath, then the year that Christ died, they would observe Pentecost on Sivan the 8th rather than on Sivan the 6th. Now, the Pharisees, they count as Orthodox Jews do today. So the Pharisees would have observed it on Sivan the 6th, back in Acts 2 when that had happened. But prophecies I've shown would indicate it would have properly have been observed on Sivan the 8th, on Sunday, not on Friday. Maybe that, this is total speculation on my part, I realize that, but maybe that is why Acts 2:1 states, when the day of Pentecost had fully come. Maybe it came to the Pharisees on Sivan the 6th, but maybe it did not fully come until Sivan the 8th. That's just total speculation on my part, I realize that. But it kind of fits in with what Scripture tends to tell us. But I want to just close with one final thing here. Here is what one objective SDA scholar, by the name of, a lot of you know him, Dr. Samuel Bacchiocchi, who died a few years ago, I believe. But he was challenged on the holy days at one time by one of the ministers actually in United. And he looked into it. I don't know if he ever observed them or not, but he actually wrote 2 booklets on them, as some of you know. But this is what he wrote in his book entitled God's Festivals in Scripture and History, Part 1, The Spring Festivals. This is what he wrote on page 231 of that particular book in regards to counting to Pentecost. This is what, he's totally objective, independent researcher. Nothing tied in with us at all. This is what he found out in his research on which is the proper way to count to Pentecost. He wrote on page 231 of that book, God's Festivals in Scripture and History, Part 1, which Sabbath is meant, the weekly Sabbath or the annual Sabbath. The question became one of the outstanding points of contention between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Pharisees interpreted the Sabbath as the festival day, and he says Passover, actually first day of unleavened bread, as we realize, is a festival day. But he does have the right day. He says Nisan 15th. Of course, Nisan 15th would have been the first day of unleavened bread. It says, thus the Pharisees waved the first sheaf of barley on the following day, on Nisan 16th. From that day, they counted the 50 days to Pentecost, this being the prevailing Jewish tradition that has continued to this day. Again, this is all quoting Dr. Bacchiocchi. The Sadducees, however, supported by the Boethusians, the Karaites, and the Samaritans, took the word Sabbath to mean literally the first Sabbath that fell during the week of unleavened bread. This means they counted the 50 days from the first Sunday after Passover. Consequently, Pentecost for them would always fall on the same day of the week, namely on Sunday. This method of reckoning Pentecost, quoting Dr. Bacchiocchi here, this method of reckoning Pentecost was widely accepted in early Christianity, apparently even by Quartodeciman Christians who observed Passover on the fixed date of Nisan the 14th. So Dr. Bacchiocchi then, in his objective research, indicated to him that the early Christian church widely counted to Pentecost from the weekly, more after the weekly Sabbath. That's what his research told him. So I want to conclude this series then at that point. But in conclusion, let me just summarize this entire series of Bible studies on the calendar with these 5 main points I would like to end on. Number 1, the calendar and calendar issues will not be settled until Christ returns. It's a complicated subject, as we've seen. And there's questions that are going to continue on until Christ returns. It won't be settled until Christ returns. Number 2, until then, whatever group you keep the holy days with will have to determine when to appoint them and when to observe them. Number 3, to do that, they will either have to use the Hebrew calendar or some other calendar of their own making. Because all these groups, they can't agree on which is the correct calendar to use. If you get rid of the Hebrew calendar, don't use that. And as we've seen, there is no biblical calendar that everyone can agree on. Now, there are many who say, yeah, there is a biblical calendar, and they try to say this or that, but those different groups that try to come up with some other calendar that's not the Hebrew calendar, say there's a biblical calendar, they can't agree what that biblical calendar should be, among themselves, that is. So there really is no biblical calendar that they can agree upon. Number 4, the holy days were given to us to observe so we can understand God's plan of salvation. If you don't keep the holy days, if you don't understand the meaning of the holy days, how they all pertain and point to Jesus Christ, you will not correctly or fully understand God's plan of salvation for mankind. Those are revealed through keeping God's annual feasts and holy days. And the Hebrew calendar does that, as well as, if not better than any other calendar that can be devised, as far as helping us to keep those holy days in a way that we can understand their meaning, how they point and picture and portray God's plan of salvation through Jesus Christ. So there's really no reason or purpose for trying to devise some other calendar. All that accomplishes, as you look at history, is strife and division. That's all it accomplishes. Number 5, this is the final point, and I think a very good point, is that we should not judge one another over issues of the calendar. It's a complicated issue. We shouldn't be judging one another. God looks at and is going to judge our hearts, as we know. That's the bottom line in all this. God looks at and will judge our hearts. not on how perfectly we understand all things. We're never going to understand all things perfectly, and there's going to be some things that we will not understand until Christ returns. And that's true for all of us. In the meantime, God will judge our hearts and our attitudes, and he will refine our hearts until, quote, we all come to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, to a perfect man, to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. Ephesians 4, verse 13. That's what we're all striving for, to come to the very stature and maturity of Jesus Christ. That is our ultimate goal. And to attain the spiritual maturity of Christ, so we can be, we want to attain the spiritual maturity of Christ, I should say, so we can be ready to become the bride of Christ at his return. That is our purpose for being called at this time. That's what we should be focusing on. So with that note, then, I will conclude this series of Bible studies on the calendar.